attendance of closing dishes. Normally, you wouldn't reach the audience. The reason we're using it is simply here for the live stream because while the people in the room are possible people on the camera, potential video people.
Yeah, we can start and if you see people coming in, you know that we can continue with the presentation. It's too loud.
It's too loud?
Is it too loud for you on the back or is it just right? Just right. Okay.
All
right. Yeah.
I mean, I hope it's audible at the same time, it's not too loud.
Yeah. Continue with the presentation.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for being here. We're here today for a two-part seminar by Deputy Governor Odo and Dr. Shweta. And
that's right. Okay.
I hope we all at the same time, it's not too loud. We're hearing ourselves. And it's been good. Thank you. Again, hello once again, and thank you for coming. Like I said, we're here for a two-part seminar, and it's the event today is titled Carving the Future of Macroeconomic Policy. So as you can guess, this is about where macroeconomic policy in general is headed. And of course, about the talks, the speakers will give you a better idea than I could possibly. But one thing I want to say before we start is oftentimes in sort of a lot of discourse we encounter, we have people who are academics and then there's people who practice out there. And oftentimes we don't get the right balance of, the best of both worlds to say. But our speakers here today offer us exactly that. So I hope that you will get the most out of this talk. Just before we start, some ground rules. I want to make sure that all our phones are on silent so we don't have a stray ringer just popping up in the middle. Please keep your voices also to a minimum. We don't want any disruptive sort of, intrusions when the speakers are here presenting. Other than that, there's nothing in particular, but yeah, we'd appreciate just that the noise level is kept to a minimum. Now, introducing the speakers themselves, Deputy Governor Odo has been at the forefront of numerous reforms in both economic and financial arenas, having occupied numerous prestigious positions, including being a member of the Council for Budget Responsibility and the supervisor, and as a part of the supervisory board of the Slovak Savings Bank. Mr. Odo has had a significant role in the financial policies of the Slovak Republic, having served as the director of the Ministry's Institute for Finance Policy and as the chief economist at the Ministry of Finance. Furthermore, he was the advisor to the Slovak Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, and actively took part in the formulation of reform policies such as the Euro Adoption Plan, tax and pension changes, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and the Value for Money project. I also hear he is the author of a bestseller back in Slovakia. So, without further ado, I welcome Mr. Odo. Welcome.
Good evening to everyone, and thank you for the kind introduction. Actually, I can start with my book because that is not an academic book. During COVID, I heard what my daughter was learning in the secondary school, I was terrified. Why are they learning, so old concepts and repetitive things and memorizing things? So I was disgusted. So I decided that I will write a book for her about the really important topics in life. So I wrote a book about that. It's about biology, physics, economics, financial literacy, whatever. And I heard actually yesterday that it is somehow connected to the spirit of Ashoka University, because also here at Ashoka, you at the undergraduate level, you have many different subjects. You can have literature, you can have physics, mathematics, and that is actually the idea of the book. That first, you need to look at the menu and taste some of the meats, and what is really tasty for you, you can have it later on at the graduate level. So that was my motivation to write that book. But today I'm not going to talk about my book. Today I'm going to talk about the future of monetary policy. And actually, it is good to be back, because I was here 4 years ago, and we were talking about currency regimes changing from our old currency to the euro. So these were very challenging times. But today there is something even more challenging, which is how to have a stable monetary system in the world, or in the euro area in particular. So let's start with the first slide. From time to time, I will come here and okay. So actually, Bill Rogers, who was a famous U.S. humorist, he said that there have been 3 great inventions in the world, which is fire, the wheel, and central bank. My central bank. Oh, sorry. I used to walk around and talk to the students more closely, but okay, I will say it. So can you imagine that you can print out just a piece of paper, you write a number on it, and it is something worthy for you. Much, if you put there 1 million, that's a huge amount of money here, but not everybody can do that, and the central bank can do it. Actually, this is the huge power of the central bank to flood the economy with money, and money is something like a lubricant which helps the wheels of the economy to turn around. And interesting thing is that you can have too much of it in circulation, then you have inflation, or too little, and then you have deflation. So we are fighting between 2 rocks. One is the inflation and one is the deflation rock. And that is actually the story of the last 15 years in monetary policy. So I will tell you the main lessons from that period. And also I will try to explain that what are the novelties in macroeconomic policy making. The interesting thing is that I also teach at the university, and I had no textbook, because we had too many crisis periods in the last 15 years, and textbook writers have not been able to catch up with the actual development. So there will be some potentially new slides for you. But those who are really, whose attention span is a bit limited, I will start with my conclusions right now, and then you can relax and enjoy the second part of the presentation. So basically, the first conclusion is that in the past, let's say between the 80s and the early 2000s, there was only game in town, which was monetary policy. There was almost no conference on fiscal policy, and everybody believed that the monetary policy can stabilize it. And of course, the monetary policy makers were very proud of themselves, that they are the kings of the universe and they can do stabilization. And actually, a Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Luca, or Professor Luca, said that we solved the problem of depression prevention, which of course later was a bit discussed, but one of the main lessons from all these crisis episodes is that that is just one leg of the macroeconomic policy framework. And you need, on one leg, it is quite hard to find balance. So therefore, you need other policies also to complement monetary policy, especially in crisis times. And we have two very good candidates. One is, of course, fiscal policy, which is the the three from the third from the bottom, monetary fiscal coordination should be taken seriously. But also we have a new kid on the block, which is macroprudential policy. I will not talk about macroprudential policy today, but 4 years ago I had a colleague here who delivered a lecture on macroprudential policy. And the main problem is that we have really, really huge shocks which are outside the control of monetary policy. And I will show you in a minute how the framework changed actually in monetary policy and what are the new additions and what can we do about it. So when central bankers will come to university and they will look very serious and saying that everything is in their hands, don't believe that. That's not the right thing to do so. And I will show you on a few slides why is that the case. Okay, so let's move to the next slide, which is, we just stay here for 5 seconds because that is the building of the National Bank of Slovakia, just to show you some architecture. Okay, but let's go further. It is not so important to have the details on that slide. I will explain it a bit. So basically, before the financial crisis, we had a two-button monetary policy, which is a green button and a red button. A green button was decreasing the interest rates of the central bank, and the red button was increasing. And on the left part of the slide, actually, you can see the workings of the economy, how the transmission from that button, what are the circuits in the economy, and the end result was what is at the bottom is prices or the inflation. So with the right clicking of the two buttons, it was believed that you can manage the whole economy. And of course, there are also other things in the economy which is not really related to monetary policy. And these are on the right side of the picture, which are exogenous shocks to the economy, for example, from risk premium, bank capital, global economy, fiscal policy, commodity prices. And everybody thought that that part is not so important. These shocks are coming and going, but they are rarely persistent. There are small shocks will come and go. So, it's we can look through to them. It's not so important for monetary policy. And the last 15 years was a case study when almost all boxes showed us that these shocks can be really huge and persistent. So what we should do is, now what we are doing is basically we are trying to incorporate those boxes which are on the right side to the basic workings of our models, which is on the left side. So that is the main lesson of the crisis. So the euro crisis was because of the risk premia. The big financial crisis was because of the bank capital. The deglobalization is not putting pressures on prices. We will get back to that. Fiscal policy, the US fiscal stimulus brought us inflation in the world, and commodity prices is clearly related to the war. So if you need one lesson from this presentation, is that we need to rethink the whole framework of monetary policy and putting all the boxes on the right side to the left side of the picture, which is quite easier just to take up a box and deliver it to the other side of the picture. But in terms of modeling, understanding the workings of the economy, it is quite hard to do. And now we can move to the next picture, which is basically kind of an illustration of that lesson. On the left side, you see the GDP. This is the US business cycle, actually. And you can see that in the middle, from the, let's say, 80s to the 2000s, there are almost no negative numbers. So basically, it was extreme stability in terms of economic growth. And if you look at the picture on the right side, you can see that inflation was fluctuating around 2%. So these were the golden years of inflation targeting. Everybody thought that if it can work for 30 years, it can work also for 100 years. But then you can see the huge movements. The shaded areas are the recessions in the US economy. So you can see first the financial crisis, then there is a huge recession, which is COVID related. And of course, now we had a slowdown because of the energy crisis. So this is the graphical illustration of the changing nature of the shocks in the economy. And we can go to the next slide, which is a very important. This is the, if you want to scare central bankers, you should wake them up during the night and show them that picture. And this picture is worse than the worst nightmares, which is a declining natural rate in the economy. I will explain what is that. Natural rate is a kind of an equilibrium rate, interest rate in the economy. And central banks are doing that. If they want to slow the economy, they increase the rates above the natural rate. And if they want to stimulate the economy, they decrease it below the natural rate. The problem with that is that if those rates are declining and it is very close to zero at the end, how can we decrease the rates to -5, -10%? We cannot do that. Why? Why a central bank cannot set interest rate at -10? I can do that. I can go to the office and sign a decree that, let's have -10 from tomorrow. What is the problem? This is the problem. Because this has zero interest rates, so nobody would put his money or her money in the bank at -10 because this is an alternative and this you have for zero. And so with a declining natural rate of interest, central bankers were really cornered. It was hard to stimulate the economy anymore. And they had to come up with new policies, actually, which is called usually unconventional monetary policy. Not the two-button policy, but we had to install much more buttons. So now we have not only the two monitors, unemployment, inflation, and two buttons, but we have more buttons here. So we are playing with the buttons like kids are playing, their video games. Okay, so let's go one slide further, which is just an illustration what can go wrong in that system. But I already told you that almost everything can go wrong. The last 15 years is a proof of that. Please, the next slide. So the next slide, please. So basically, one of the biggest problems is that when we go down to zero with the natural rate, we are hitting the so-called zero lower bound or effective lower bound. We can go little bit below zero. We can set it, let's say -0.5. Why? I told you that this is the alternative. So why? Why we can?
This is safety. Because want to keep them on the balance sheet.
Exactly. So if you would like to take it out, like a company would like to take out 100 million euros or 100 million, you need to pay the security, you need to build vaults in your company. That is costly. And therefore, you can go a bit lower than zero. And that is why we are talking about effective lower bound and not just zero, because it can be a bit below. Market disruptions and uncovered expectations and huge external shocks, which are the most important in this topic. Okay, so let's move one slide. And I wanted to tell you that the main innovation after the financial crisis was this macroprudential policy. The aim of the macroprudential policy is not to look at individual banks and financial institutions, but the market as such. Because if you just focus on every individual institution, you will not spot the problem. Because if they are exposed to the same shocks, there can be like domino effects. So one fails, the next one fails, and it can trigger a so-called fire sales. And that can have a huge impact on markets. Actually, 4 years ago at the Jindal University, I talked about the reasons for the financial crisis. And so now in central bank, especially in central bank in Slovakia, we are not just looking at monetary and fiscal policy, but we are very active in the macroprudential field. And this is quite interesting because it can be politically sensitive if you set a target that somebody will not get a loan because of it, because you will tell the banks that people with income less than 2 times the repayment cannot have the loan or something like that. So we have an interesting toolkit for that, but this is just an illustration that it is not just about 2 policies. We have a third one now. Please, the next slide. This is just to show that you can see the macroprudential measures on the left side before the financial crisis. It is hard to distinguish the bars from zero. Now you can see that macroprudential policies are all over the place. So this is really one of the nice innovations. Please, the next slide. Yes. Okay. So we survived the financial crisis somehow. But that was not the end of the story, not the end of the problems. So the first problem was that actually with the falling natural rate of interest, it was very hard to stimulate the economy because we were already at zero. So it was a problem which is really hard to explain to the public. Too low inflation. How can we explain public? The problem is too low inflation. Prices, are stable. That's fine. But of course, one warning example is Japan. In Japan, the forecasters have a very easy job. They just put zeros everywhere. For the GDP growth, for interest rates, for inflation, and that will not be far away from the truth. Because they converge with the expectations to that unfortunate equilibrium where they cannot grow very fast and the central bank cannot do anything to stimulate the economy. So we do not want to get there. And that is the reason while the Fed, the euro area, all these institutions try to avoid that trap. So they came up with new policies in order to stimulate the demand to move the inflation far away from zero. Actually, this is a huge achievement that the inflation was not in negative territory. We had no deflation. That was a huge achievement because many people in the US still remember the negative consequences of the Great Depression, where prices fell by 20, 30%, and it was really a huge problem for the economy. Unemployment was 25%. So that is really scary. So on one hand, it was a great achievement. There was a credibility of the central banks in this game that were so credible that at least they could maintain stable prices, but not their target level of 2% inflation. Okay. Let's move to the next slide. So finally, 2-3 years ago, we started to see the green shoots of inflation. So we were happy, smiling. You could see smiling faces of central bankers. The inflation was closer to the target. And, why was that? Because after the worst days of COVID, the demand picked up and there was not enough supply also because the Chinese policy of no COVID. Also, there were problems in the supply chains of goods. And therefore, we could see pickup in inflation. And a lot of people see that as of course, that's a nice thing. Finally, maybe we can normalize monetary policy, go back to the 2-button world. We will never go back to that. I will tell you later, but definitely that was the idea at that time. And then the war came, and also we had a huge energy crisis, and all the inflation numbers were over the roof. So from a very low inflation, we got an extremely high inflation. So for some period of time, you could argue that, okay, on average, we are fine. On average, it's 2%. Let's say we are fine. So the first reaction of central bankers was that it is just temporary. Don't bother with it. On average, we are fine. But again, the shocks are so persistent that now central bankers are moving quickly with their rates in order to curb down inflation. And why inflation shoot up so quickly and what were the consequences for monetary policy? That is on the next 3 slides. So there are 3 important factors. The first factor is expectation. So if you have high inflation for longer, it can actually impact inflationary expectations. And if more people expect high inflation will come. So one problem was that many economists focused on one number, a median expectation, median price expectation. But that was just part of the story. So again, there was a growing number of people expecting much higher inflation. So tails of the distribution were very far away in some cases from the median. And you can see that on that slide that the distribution was shifting. And the last thing monetary policymakers would like to have is unanchored inflationary expectation, because that is a different regime and nobody will trust the central bank anymore. And that is a huge problem. So maybe that was a mistake. So I would say, I can tell it here, okay? Not officially at home, that it was a mistake that central bankers focused too much on that one number and a bit ignored the movements in the distribution of inflation. Okay, so let's go to the second slide, which is again about the credibility of the central banks. So we put a lot of weight on our credibility. Since we have 30 years of, it is called great moderation. Great moderation because everything was stable, no huge shocks before the financial crisis. It's golden years of macroeconomic policy, or in other words, very boring macroeconomic policy. So you are extremely fortunate to live in these times, because if you can solve all these problems, we cannot solve this because we learned the old stuff. Now you can learn the new stuff, and you will be the new chief economists of central banks, so you can solve all this for us. So we put too much weight on credibility, and the credibility was eroding. You can see that on that slide, which is the portion of inflation expectations over 4%. The blue line is in the US, and the other line is in the euro area. So you can see that despite the fact that the media numbers were relatively okay, there was a huge threat of an inflation disaster if we de-anchor the expectations. That is a problem. And the third reason was that we really thought that it is temporary, and therefore we cannot do too much about it. So basically, the mistake was that, at least from my perspective, some of the big central banks reacted too late to the inflation. Of course, the inflation shock is too big. It is impossible for monetary policy to smooth it out to 2%. It's impossible. But at least maybe we could have done a bit better in this area. So let's move 2 slides ahead. One more, okay? So what can we do about it? What can we do a bit differently? Is that we need to explain the public what we are doing, because if you are transparent enough, you can much more easily correct your mistakes. You need to strike a good balance between tightening and recession risks, because a lot of people say, why are you increasing interest rates right now? There are recession fears. Are you crazy? Increasing interest rates. The problem is that the economy can go into a mild recession? And the answer is that what is the alternative? Permanently high inflation is a much worse regime than sacrifice for 2 quarters or 3 quarters in the growth rate of the economy. So for the sake of the stability of the economy, it's much better to have a small recession than a never-ending story with high inflation. So it is very painful for a lot of customers because these papers are eroding at a much faster pace. And that is a problem. By the way, do you know which was the biggest nominal value on the banknote in circulation? This is just 100 rupees, but
10 trillion.
10 trillion. That is how many zeros after one?
Many zeros.
How many? How many? 30. Okay, that's not the world record. 70. Was in Hungary after the Second World War. I still have the banknote, and it was so many zeros that they did not put the zeros on the banknote. They just called billion, 100 million billion, because it was easier to put it in in words than in numbers. So the inflation can be really catastrophic. So it is the best policy is. To avoid the inflation to pick up. Okay, so we can move one more slide, which is now the most important slide for central bankers. Because of course we cannot do too much with energy prices. We do not have a huge energy reserves below our building. We went down to the -3rd floor, we found nothing. So we cannot do too much with it. So what we can do is to anchor expectations. And what we can do is to keep the secondary effect of inflation in control. And that is what we call core inflation. Core inflation is a measure where you take out from the inflation figures the more volatile component to understand what is the trend behind inflation. And on the left side, all those lines are measures of core inflation. And you can see they are still increasing in the EU area. So our job is not done yet. We need to do more in order to curb down core inflation because that is dangerous if it stays high. Why? Because it can feed through wage negotiations, price setting mechanisms. And if you, adjust wages with inflation every year, you can create a circle where actually it is very hard to break it down again because everybody will expect that the inflation will stay at 4, 5, 6%. And it is very hard to persuade the public that that is not the case if you lose your credibility. So it is of utmost importance for central bankers to keep their credibility right now. Okay, so let's move to the unconventional part a bit because I told you that we installed a lot more buttons now on our desk. So at my desk, I have at least 4 or 5 new buttons. And I will at least try to explain you how to think about those measures. So please, let's move to the next slide. So basically, we had this normal period, which is old conventional policy tools. This is the first box on the left side. Now we move to the new, I call it new conventional, because it is not unconventional anymore. This is the convention right now, and it will not diminish anytime soon. And actually, we have a third category, which is an experiment in the euro area, in a currency union, where we are not just focusing on new policies, but we are also focusing on tools how to protect the transmission mechanism of monetary policy. What is the transmission mechanism? I showed you that slide on the left side there where the circuits of monetary policy, how that is working. So a lot of central banks are now focusing also on the transmission, not just the tools, what you can use, but also the effectiveness of the tools. So on 2 fronts, we are fighting. I'm not sure about the third box, but the second box will remain, which is forward guidance, purchases of new assets, and targeted longer-term operation, negative rate policies. Since the natural rate went down, with the next recession, we can easily see again some purchases, asset purchases by central banks. So, and now if we move, I can tell you a bit how to think about unconventional monetary policy. The conventional was that the central bank had a 2-week rate, a 1-day rate, and it was all about these two buttons. But the problem was that when we reach zero with that short interest rates, what can we do? We can, put a white flag, say, okay, you cannot do anything more. No, we started to focus not only on the beginning of this curve. This is a so-called yield curve. You have the yields on the vertical axis, and you have the maturity on the horizontal axis. So in the previous regime, the central banks cared mainly about that first point on the left, on that black line. And now we care about the whole curve, actually. Why? How? Because what we try to achieve with unconventional monetary policy is to push down also the longer end of the curve to zero. Because even if you hit zero with your short-term rate, longer rate can be still much above zero. So what we did is we bought a lot of stuff, government bonds, and if you buy a lot of it, of course the interest rate will go down, 10-year bonds, 20-year bonds, 30-year bonds. And with forward guidance is a kind of a commitment to maintain a low interest rates for a longer period of time. So with forward guidance, you can manage the middle part of that yield curve. So actually what we are doing in unconventional times is we are managing the yield curve with various things. We can buy assets, we can promise something, we can actually go negative on the short end of the curve. So all these policies can be presented with the help of this slide. And there are two lines. I added two lines. The first line, which is the thin line, this is the risk-free. This is the government bond curve. But the central banks can also focus on private assets. So these are more risky assets. So that is the risky yield curve. So many central banks also bought private assets, commercial papers, mortgage-backed securities, and so on. So now we really installed much more buttons, and we have much more levers how to play with the yield curve and how to help the economy to go out of the recession. Okay, and just to save time, I will talk about the long-term perspective of inflation. So we can go to the next section. Yes? Yes, so basically, this is about the past. We need new models. We now have more tools. With more tools, we even need more models to understand what is the interaction between our new tools, because that is quite hard to understand. But that is not enough. We have actually headwinds, many headwinds. So I will tell about, I guess, 3 or 4 headwinds which are complicating massively our life. So let's move to the next slide. One is role of fiscal and monetary policy interactions. So actually, you could see that before the US stimulus, central banks were doing many things without a huge sanctions. It was almost impossible to increase inflation with monetary policy tools, with unconventional policy. Why? Because you are playing not with the money in the economy, the circulation, but with the price. The price of the money is the interest rate. So what you are doing with monetary policy, changing the price, trying to motivate people to spend more, trying to motivate firms to invest more, but that is an indirect way. Fiscal policy can put this on the desks of households. So it is not about the price of the money. They can put real money into the pockets of households. And that is much more powerful for the inflation they're just playing around with the price, especially at the zero level. So what we need to understand much better is the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy. And if you have a high inflation, you need a fiscal policy to be conservative, not to spend a lot, because if they spend a lot, you know, we will have much more inflationary pressures. And Martin will talk about these things in a few minutes. So I will not spend a lot of time on it, but just you need to understand that it is quite hard to curb deficits and debt levels when you are facing a lot of challenges in your economy. Okay. Just for illustration purposes, the climate change and climate policy is also fueling inflation, because of course, what we need to achieve is a higher price for carbon. If we need to achieve a higher price for carbon, that means higher inflation. So, but that is a kind of a permanent component to inflation in the next, hopefully next few decades. But definitely it is a headwind from a monetary policy perspective. It is the right policy to do, but for a monetary policy maker, it is something to analyze, to go much more deeply into that topic. Please. And then something else is a demographical change, which is, of course, maybe not yet a huge problem for India, but it is a huge problem for the Western world, actually, and also for China, for example, because of the one-child policy. So, if you have can't be too many, but many. If you have many young people in the economy, that is actually disinflationary. Why is that? Why is it disinflation? The ratio of the young people compared to this relative decreases inflation. Because you have a production capacities, you have too many people, you can hire anybody, they will not ask for a salary increase because there are 3 or 4 others waiting outside, they want but if that balance is changing and you have a lot of people over the retirement age and not too many in the working age population, that is actually inflation. And that we will see in the future. So that is on the right part is the estimate of the Bank for International Settlements. Actually, the upper part is the next, I guess, 30 years average, and the lower part is the past. So in the past, demography was disinflationary. These are these red bars. But with the change in the aging population, it will be inflation. So again, these are just pressures we need to take into account when doing monetary policy. Okay, and let's move to the last slide, which is a fourth complicating factor, which is deglobalization. Again, if you globalize something, that is disinflationary, because you are injecting a new pool of workers to the markets. And that is something like with the aging population that you have more people, more options. And the king is the firm. But with the aging population, of course, the king is the employee. And with deglobalization, again, the king is more the employee. And firms are coming back and producing with more expensive resources because they moved to other countries because that was much cheaper to them. If they move back, of course, that means more inflation. So basically, what I wanted to say is that we need to understand much better the workings of the shocks which are hitting the economy. We failed to do that because we thought that we solved all the problems. 30 years we delivered stability. So we need to be more humble, and we need to talk more to fiscal policy, talk to macroprudential policymakers, and on the top of it, that is not enough. We have at least 4 headwinds which will be hard to tackle. But you are here to do that. It's not my job. I will go retire in the next 20 years, but you can solve all these problems. Okay, so I started with a quote. I also end with a quote that actually this is the lesson from the late reply that, the first panacea for a mismanaged nation is inflation. The second is war. You can imagine, just print a bit more money. That will help us. Just, initiate a war and take out something from another nation. But all these policies are extremely short-sighted. From a longer perspective, and you should have a longer perspective because politicians do not have a longer perspective. At least economists should have that. And in a long-term perspective, you need both price stability and, of course, peace. So thank you very much.
We'll spend 10-15 minutes on questions.
Maybe I would suggest that Martin can continue, and then we will stand here side by side to answer your questions, either on monetary, fiscal, and other policies. And let's see.
And in the meantime, I would suggest that those who have questions can write down the questions and see how many overlaps there is, so you can.
Because it can enrich a discussion a bit if you see the both perspectives.
Thank you so much. We got an order. So now we move on to the second talk of the evening, which is going to be delivered by Dr. Schuster. Dr. Schuster is a member of the Council of Budget Responsibility of Slovakia. Prior to this, he was the director of the research department at the National Bank for the period 2007 to 2021. During 2007 to 2009, he chaired the working group for communication on the euro introduction in Slovakia, and he was coordinating the changeover information campaign. He's the chairman of the board of the Transparency International Slovakia since 2017. He also chaired the Slovak Economic Association for many years until 2020. Dr. Schuster received a doctorate in economics from the University of Maryland at College Park, USA, specializing in macroeconomics and labor markets. His research interests include macroeconomics, convergence, monetary policy, and research quality assessment. And finally, he is lectured at several Slovak universities. Dr. Schuster.
Thank you very much. Is this still working? I don't think so. All right, so then I don't have.
Yeah, all working. I exhausted my.
Okay. So, can you please pull up my presentation? All right, so thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. Basically what I'm going to tell you now was already part of Ludo's presentation, so you already know everything you need to know, or most of it. Maybe I will just put a little different spin on that stuff. So to be short, I'm going to argue that the relative balance of power has changed recently between monetary and fiscal policy. And as Ludo has said, for decades, we believe that monetary policy can by itself achieve macroeconomic stability. And now we need that fiscal policy is necessary in many situations. And to some extent, I will argue that fiscal policy can be more effective, and we might even get unexpected results that benefit both the fiscal side and the monetary side. So please move forward. So in a way, and here I'm maybe going to repeat what you have learned in the first few weeks of your macroeconomic course. So both monetary and fiscal policy from macroeconomic perspective are demand tool management. So very similar on the basic charts of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. What the difference is that monetary policy works by adjusting interest rates or exchange rates or some of the unconditional tools that Ludo has mentioned. And then you need to go through the effects on savings, investments, exports, imports, and especially expectations of people and of businesses to achieve changes in inflation and unemployment. On the other hand, fiscal policy directly contributes to aggregate demand. Okay? Government is usually the biggest individual spender in the economy. So you immediately get the extra money into the economy, or you can extract money from the economy. You get some indirect effects, and some of the interesting ones are Ricardian effects. If government is spending a lot and people start having doubts about future taxes or future spending, and if government just gives you money, you think that one day we'll have to repay it, and maybe I save money right now. So if people were 100% rational, and that's the idea of David Ricardo, they would completely offset what the government is doing via fiscal policy. So fortunately for us, people are not 100% rational, and that's maybe one of the basic assumptions of economics when you start learning economics, that people are rational. Now I'm telling you that well, we rely on people not being 100% rational, but yeah, in the real world, we need people to lost this one as well. Okay. So I'll just try to talk loud. So in the real world, we have unexpected consequences, and one of them is that indirect effect may offset part of the fiscal policy, but still it works more directly. So to go more into detail, the transmission of monetary policy, the traditional monetary policy via interest rates. If you want to have expansionary policy, you just decrease interest rates. For a while, real interest rates go below the natural rate, so the economy is expanding. Even when you start increasing nominal rates, the real interest rates is still below the natural rate, so economy is still expanding. The other chart you see, you have seen the chart a few minutes ago, okay? But now I don't, or a similar one, but now I don't want to go through details, okay? Ludo has already given you all the details. The point of this chart is only to show that the transmission mechanism of monetary policy is complicated. While with fiscal policy, it's very simple. Okay, in your macro courses, this is maybe one of the very first charts you see. Okay, it's the Keynesian cross, and you have that demand is equal to production, and the government increases demand, and okay, that's the going from point A to point B, and then you have some multiplier effects, which can be larger or smaller. And only later on during the course, you learn that even the multipliers can go back. Okay, so you don't, maybe you don't end up in point A prime, maybe you go back a little bit. But anyway, what the government does is directly shifting the curve. So fiscal policy transmission is much more straightforward. Okay, I'll go sideways a little bit. So in special case, fiscal policy might even seem omnipotent. And that happens if you have fixed exchange rate, which here in India, last time you had some remains of fixed exchange rate was in 1993. So maybe not many of you remember what happened in 93. Okay. But okay, basically what is happening if the government is trying to help the economy and puts more money into the economy, what happens is that the interest rates go up. But if the central bank wants to keep fixed exchange rate, it needs to push interest rates down. And the only way to push interest rates down is to inject more money into the economy. So in fixed exchange rate environment, the reaction of monetary policy to fiscal expansion is that the monetary policy also needs to expand. So what you end up is a very large increase in output or very large increase in employment, because monetary policy needs to react in a supporting way to the fiscal policy. So under fixed exchange rate, the fiscal policy is the only way only game in town, and it becomes immensely powerful. Okay. Remember this slide because I'll come back to it towards the end. Okay. So kind of back to some of the really simple textbook charts that you have seen. In the simple aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, both monetary and fiscal policies work the same. Okay? Both of them are demand management tools. So both of them would shift the aggregate demand curve, and you temporarily increase employment and output. The price of that would be increase in inflation. If we go into a little more detail with monetary policy, once more. Okay. So with monetary policy, you temporarily increase output, and it's relatively fast. Okay, on this chart, you get the peak effect in about 3 or 4 quarters, and then, as you know, over time you get back to the long-run equilibrium. Okay? You can only increase output above the potential for a little while. But it takes a while. Okay? As you can see on the chart, it might take 3 or 4 years for the aggregate supply to adjust. And eventually we get to the natural rate of output. But it does take time. And at the beginning, the first shift of the aggregate demand curve, that's relatively fast in economic terms, that it's just a couple of quarters. With fiscal policy, and then this is the reverse effect, okay, so that I'm not showing you just expansion. This would be a fiscal consolidation. And when the government is trying to slow down economy, or when the government is trying to save, we temporarily get extra unemployment or lower output. And then, but this might take longer. And then also the adjustment back towards equilibrium might again take longer. So if we get into the details of macroeconomic policy making, monetary policy is much faster. Okay, the monitoring of the economy is much more frequent. Basically, the central bankers, they start their day by looking at the financial markets. They have longer reports every month. Usually you have quarterly macroeconomic forecasts, which are very detailed. So anything that is happening in the economy, the central bank sees relatively quickly and can decide on relatively quickly. In normal times, most central banks in the world have official meetings setting the interest rates every 2 or 3 weeks. But if necessary, it's just a couple of phone calls and they can arrange a meeting next day or the same day and make a decision. What follows after the decision is something which Milton Friedman has called long and variable lags. So sometimes going through the whole complicated transmission mechanism, sometimes it's 3 months, sometimes it's 6, or sometimes it's 9 months. And you never really know how long it will take. but you can keep adjusting in the meantime if it doesn't work the way you expected. On the other hand, fiscal policy, adjusting fiscal policy is complicated because you have the political complications. Just drafting the government budget usually takes at least half a year. Okay? In most countries, by the time a budget for next fiscal year is passed in the parliament, the Ministry of Finance already starts preparing the budget for next year. Also, the monitoring is slower because very often the government doesn't even know how much money it has already spent. It doesn't get the reports every morning when the finance minister wakes up and gets into his office. He doesn't find the report saying how much taxes were collected yesterday and how much was spent yesterday. And even if the government wants to make a decision, it would take much longer. Okay? First, the Minister of Finance needs to make a decision. Then he needs to persuade the whole government that they need to act. Then they need to persuade the parliament that they need to adjust the law on the budget. And the final complication is that sometimes the governments don't have much space to move. Okay? If the country is heavily indebted, then spending even more might not be possible because nobody wants to lend you more. But then once the government decides, things start to move very fast, if they can do that. Okay? It also depends on how the government wants to spend the money. If they just decrease your taxes and you see extra net payment in your next paycheck, that's very fast. If they decide to increase pensions and send extra pension payments to the pensioners, that's very fast, and the money is immediately in the economy. If the government decides to build a new highway, but you start about thinking where the highway will go, and then people from different towns will start lobbying that I want the highway to go next to my town and not next to their neighboring town. Then you have to persuade people in charge of environmental protection that you will not destroy some extra sensitive frog species in the area by building the highway. And then you need to start public procurement and bidding and everything. And by the time the highway is built, the recession might be over. Okay, so in many cases, it's very hard to get fiscal policy moving, but once it starts moving, then the transmission into real economy is very fast. Okay, so somehow to sum it up, our beliefs until the global financial crisis were that monetary policy can react very quickly and that it is strong enough. And people have, in fact, believed that we can fine-tune macroeconomic fluctuations just by monetary policy. So maybe it was excessive pride on the side of central bankers, and well, I was one of them back then. But we really believe that the monetary policy is this very precise science, which you just turn the buttons and you fine-tune the macroeconomy. And in fact, we often believe that it's not only a science, but it's an art, because sometimes you don't have to actually decrease or increase interest rates. You just need to persuade people that inflation will be stable, or persuade people that inflation will go down. So central bankers believed in announcements and just standing up in front of the public and saying, we will do everything necessary for inflation to go down, that is what is necessary and also sufficient to achieve lower inflation. And if you persuade people that inflation will be low, then wages will not increase, long-term contracts will not rely on increased wages, and then inflation will actually stay low. So we believed in something which is called self-fulfilling expectations. And we also believe that we can create those self-fulfilling expectations And this is the art, or this is the dark magic of monetary policy. And it somehow worked until the global financial crisis. And then we learned that our magic somehow broke down because we didn't understand some crucial parts. And until the global financial crisis, fiscal policy was considered to be just a backup, which is clumsy, which takes a long time to work its way through all the decision-making processes. And we asked the policymakers to concentrate on greater issues, okay? Structural issues, long-term growth, redistribution, eradicating poverty, technological progress, and so on. Important things, of course. You be the judge whether the governments have achieved that, maybe in some cases. Okay. So and basically one extra thing that worked for the central bankers was that in fact the headwinds from fiscal policy into monetary policy were relatively small. Okay, so on this chart, the black dots are the net effects of fiscal policy, the contributions towards inflation. And the green bars is everything which is not influenced by fiscal policy. So that's something that the monetary policy needs to tackle. And you see that the contributions of fiscal policy towards inflation are relatively small, usually less than 1 percentage point. So in fact, monetary policy really didn't have to worry about the effects of fiscal policies. Monetary policies could concentrate on its own goal, which was inflation, and secondary goal is usually low unemployment or stable GDP growth. And we didn't really need any help from fiscal policy until recently. So what's happening now, or what's happening since the global financial crisis, is that we see that monetary policy is suddenly facing new challenges. And Ludo has explained very well that central bankers are kind of tackling the new challenges by creating new tools, by incorporating new boxes in the models. But still, I would argue that the consensus from now on is that monetary policy will be less powerful in the future. And that we need more fiscal policy in the future to manage the economy. And if we ever believe that we can fine-tune the economy, we really need fiscal policy. And one thing that is happening now is that probably fiscal multipliers are larger. So if the government spends $1 more billion in the economy, the effect on the economy can be more than 1 billion, and it could be significantly more. We also see, especially now after COVID, that fiscal policy might be responsible for inflation more explicitly. Most of the developed countries, and I think most of the large central banks, including here in India, put responsibility for inflation in the hands of central banks. And now it's a consensus, and it's often anchored in constitutions of countries, that central banks are responsible for inflation. But now we see that it will not work all the time without some support from finance ministers. So far, as far as I see, the finance ministers are not completely taking the responsibility. They are not acknowledging that it's also part of their job. But especially in the last few months, in many countries, we have seen that the governments understood that it's in fact their job to help the citizens at least cope with the higher inflation. So that now they do understand that they might have to deal with the inflation issues. And in a kind of synergic effect, we see that a monetary policy can help fiscal policy to be more sustainable. Monetary policy can take the burden of the government debt and make it a bit lighter, not completely go away, but make it a bit lighter. And in exchange, the fiscal policy can help with the inflation issues. And there's basically two reasons why this is happening. Ludo has already mentioned that we have global population aging. And on this chart, what I'm showing you is the median age. What's on the left side of the chart is what has already happened. And the gray part of the chart is the United Nations World Population Prospect. And median age, okay, if you order all the people in a country from the youngest to the oldest, the person in the middle would be the one with median age. So in the world today, median age is just about 30. Here in India, it's 28. So move here is less than 28. Okay. Okay, so you are not representative. You're not representative sample of India. But what you already can see is that the median age in India is increasing faster than in the world. And so you are projected to be on average 47 by the end of this century, which is quite a lot, okay, going from 28 to 47. So in fact, you'll be one of the countries which is hit a bit harder by aging, but not as much as Japan, okay? The median age in Japan is already 49, which makes me feel good because I'm 48. So in Japan, I would be a young person still. But by the end of the century, the median age in Japan would be 54, which, for example, not so long ago, 54 was retirement age in Slovakia for females. Okay, so and kind of difficult that more than half of your population would be retired. Okay. For some countries, such as Nigeria, it will still take some time for aging to kick in, but even there, the median age will be more than 30 by the end of the century. And they will be the youngest country by then. So, and what's happening, why population aging is in fact so large problem for monetary policy is that the young people are the ones that borrow or that start new businesses. Old people, they are saving or they have accumulated savings. So if you have more old people and they have the savings and you have fewer young people who want to use that capital in an effective way, that pushes down interest rates. And there would be less entrepreneurship in the economy. There would be too many retired people with too much savings, which you cannot utilize very well. So what's going to happen is that, next slide, please. So what's going to happen that the problem with low real interest rates, which has already begun in the developed world, this is going to spread to all the countries around the world, and the real interest rates everywhere will go down. And you have seen a very similar chart in Ludo's presentation. So this just illustrates that even different estimates from completely different institutions can give you similar results, which is kind of a good news for you as an economists. Okay, so there are empirical results that kind of corroborate each other, but it's bad news for monetary policy because that means that monetary policy will be forever harder than it was now, or maybe not forever, but at least for the next 100 years. And fiscal policy will be needed to fine-tune the economy, to keep growth stable and to keep inflation low. So kind of to repeat that monetary policy will keep hitting the zero lower bound and will keep regularly, we'll have to keep employ non-standard measures, which Ludo is saying that they will become standard, but in a way they are not non-standard because they are less effective than the ones we have considered to be standard. And on the other hand, fiscal policy would be more potent, more effective. Let's go to the next slide. And that's basically kind of repetition of the slide I have shown you at the beginning. Okay, so now please go back in your memories and try to remember the slide when I showed you that under fixed exchange rates, fiscal policy could be almost omnipotent. Of course, not completely, but very strong. So fiscal policy can be also much stronger when monetary policy hits the zero lower bound and when interest rates are zero. Okay, because then a lot of the headwinds, lot of Ricardian effects, and a lot of the pushback that can otherwise come from monetary policy are not present. And governments they can borrow very easily at zero interest rates. And nobody is trying to save. Okay, so if the government is spending more, nobody is trying to save the extra income because at zero or negative interest rates, what's the point of saving? So the fiscal multipliers can be maybe twice as large as under normal circumstances. And on the other hand, if you want to have restrictive fiscal policy, when you want to decrease inflation or when the economy is overheating, you kind of go back to the traditional regime where the monetary policy also can play. Okay? Monetary policy only becomes less effective when you need to be expansionary. But monetary policy will basically forever remain as effective as it used to be when you want to tighten inflation. And my good friend liked to find an analogy between monetary policy and pulling a rope. Okay, so let's say you are pulling a horse behind you, and when you want to go faster, you pull the rope stronger. When you want to go slower, you give some flex to the rope. But if you want to go very slowly, you cannot push the rope. Okay, so monetary policy is like when you want to pull, you can always pull faster, but when you want to give some slack to the animal or to the forces in the economy, you can only go so far as the rest of the economy wants to cooperate and pull the other end of the rope. But if they don't want to cooperate, pushing with the rope is very hard. But pulling still becomes as effective as it was. So when you are in a boom and you want to slow down the economy, then fiscal multipliers might be smaller. And this gives rise to some other magic. Okay, and now it's for the fiscal policy. Okay, because if you want to achieve the same change in the economy with the large multipliers in a recession, the government doesn't need to spend so much. And with the small multipliers in expansion, the governments can save much more. So even if the fluctuations are symmetric, the changes in the government budget don't have to be symmetric. So if the economists like to tell you that there is no free lunch, maybe here is some free lunch for the fiscal policy, that the fiscal policy can be more effective in recessions, and it doesn't have to be that effective, or that it can save some more money in expansion. Okay, there's a catch, of course. There is always a catch. And the catch is in the fiscal space. And on the left chart is the simulation, what happens when the government expands the economy by 1 percentage point. And we compare two countries. The blue country is the one which has fiscal space, a country which can easily borrow on international markets. And yellow country is a country that is heavily indebted. In this simulation, it's a country with 100% GDP, because the simulation was done on European countries, and we consider 60% to be kind of safe level of debt, and 100% is for the countries which are a bit problematic. And you see that at the beginning, the effect is almost the same. So you have, okay, the effect on the economy is almost 2%. So you see very high multiplier, around 2, which is pretty good. But then in the long run, blue country just goes back to normal, it goes back to the long-run equilibrium. Yellow country goes below normal. So the country which is heavily indebted, what is going to happen that they will have trouble financing their debts because the debt is now not considered safe. So the interest rates will go up, and financing this pile of debt, which will in fact decrease the potential of the country. And the level which is safe or not safe doesn't have to be 60 or 100 in every country. Okay, there are countries like Japan where the government debt is more than 200%, still considered safe. There are countries, and one example might be my country, Slovakia. Our debt is now 58%, and we have just been downgraded by one rating agency yesterday, citing some worries about fiscal position of the government and debt growing too fast. Okay, so just don't get hung up on the 60% being safe. For some countries, much less than 60% can be safe. Here in India, do you know what the debt level is? In percentage of GDP?
60 to 70 right now.
82. Okay. What I found is 84, but maybe you are right. So it's above 80, which for a developing country is pretty high. Okay, so here in India, I would worry a bit that debt doesn't give you as much space to to freely use fiscal policy to stabilize the economy. And your debt level increased quite a lot during the COVID crisis. And that's one of the reasons why you don't have that much space. Similarly, in Slovakia, our debt level increased by more than 10 percentage points during COVID crisis. And now we don't have so much space to fight the energy crisis. But on the other hand, we have seen in most developed countries that fiscal policy was extremely effective during COVID, and especially now during the energy crisis. Like compare with the last crisis, compare with the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, where unemployment in most developed countries increased by around 4 percentage points. And now during the energy crisis, unemployment increased by just about 1 percentage point. And that's already during very hard times for monetary policy, but also during times where fiscal policy finally were very active. And in most developed countries, you see that governments implemented a lot of programs to tackle the increased energy costs, to support households with lower purchasing power, to support businesses to keep going on and maybe even pay part of the wages and so on. So it turns out that if fiscal policy is very determined, and maybe they are so very determined only when the crisis is very deep, they can achieve very nice results if they have the fiscal space. Okay, now let me skip 3 more slides. Keep going. Okay, so, okay, one more back, okay. So I'll just now use a few minutes to kind of advertise what we do, and that is to talk about independent fiscal institutions. The reason is that basically, if we really believe what I'm trying to persuade you that fiscal policy will now be more powerful than it was in the past, we maybe need to bring also some order into fiscal policy making. And one more slide. And when you compare from macroeconomic perspective, fiscal and monetary policy, there are a lot of books written about monetary policy. And the most famous article, which maybe you have seen, is by Kidland and Prescott from 1977. It's why these two gentlemen have gotten Nobel Prize. And it's basically the foundation for why central banks are independent today. Okay? They argued that rules are more important than unlimited discretion in monetary policy. And it's not only in monetary policy, it's in very different situations, from hostage taking to protecting foreign investors. But turns out that monetary policy was the one which benefited the most from the work of Kydland and Prescott. And since basically 1980s, central banks all over the world are independent, and that's why most of us have in our constitutions that there are independent central banks, and their goal is to fight inflation. On the other hand, for fiscal policy, we still tend to believe that it's up to the government, up to our elected representatives, up to the democratic institutions to choose what they spend the taxpayers' money on. And since we elect the governments, then they have the mandate to keep spending the money in the best way they see fit. The first major exception to this was the European Treaty in 1992, which tried to put some restrictions on fiscal deficits and debts in European countries. And that's because the European countries were heading towards common currency, the euro. And we were afraid that if different countries can have too large deficits, too large debt, it could have negative effects for the common currency. And since the common currency is common good, we need some rules to protect the other members of the European monetary union from the countries that have too large debts. But it was only after the global financial crisis in 2008 that we understood that we need some rules for fiscal policy, and especially for the stability of debts, not only from the perspective of other countries, but also from the perspective of individual countries. But still, the theoretical foundation is not as strong as with monetary policy. Yet there are not so many books about why we need fiscal rules, and I hope Ludo will one day write one of those books. But turns out in practice that the rules are beneficial. Let me skip this slide. I'll skip two more slides. Okay, here we are. Okay, so this is our experience in Europe, that in fact the fiscal rules are growing very strongly. Okay, and in 1990s we had maybe just 10 rules in all 27 members of European Union. Today we have the 27 members, but we have more than 120 rules. Okay, so in fact each country has several rules. We have rules on debt, we have rules on deficit, we have rules on expenditures. We have all these different rules kind of trying to restrict the power of the government. And most of these rules are there to ensure that the debt is not too high. So the rules are not there to prevent governments from having active fiscal policy, quite the opposite. The rules are there to keep space open. And if we ever need to use fiscal policy, especially if we ever need it to be expansionary, we need to keep the space open. So most of the rules are trying to bring down debt levels so that in bad times, governments can borrow and governments can engage in expansionary policy. And I'll give you an example from Slovakia. So we are one of the countries that established the rules very quickly after global financial crisis, and the constitutional law was adopted in 2011, so a bit more than 10 years ago. The Fiscal Council was established in 2012. Most of the rules in the law are on debt, and which make this automatic. Okay, so there are different levels of sanctions which automatically apply from the constitution if the government debt is increasing. And we also had the vision for expenditure rules in the constitution, but these were only adopted this year. So I cannot tell you yet whether they work. we believe they should work, but we're not sure yet. And we also publish reports on debt sustainability, on compliance with the rules, and we estimate effects of new legislation with kind of the goal of pushing the government to include in their decision-making the effects on future debt. So maybe my final slide here is the most important number we publish is the long-term sustainability indicator. So this basically tells us how much government would need to consolidate to get to zero debt in or to not increasing debt in the long term. And long term is 50 years or more. So see that this is pretty difficult. Our current estimate is that the consolidation would need to be 5%. Okay, so that means 5% GDP consolidation would be needed on a permanent basis to stabilize our debt. Okay, which is quite a lot. Okay, usually when governments consolidate, they consolidate around 0.5 percentage point up to 1 percentage point annually. So to achieve this 10% consolidation, it would be 5 to 10 years of consolidation effort. Sometimes, if you are lucky or if you have very determined government, you can consolidate by, let's say, 2 percentage points. But anyway, this is not something which is achievable from 1 year to another, but it's to show to the government and especially to the public that we have this debt problem, and the debt problem can only be solved when we consolidate. And it doesn't mean that the government needs to cut expenditures. Maybe they increase taxes, maybe they change the productivity in the economy, maybe they improve the structure of the economy so that this changes the balance between government incomes and expenditures. But it shows that the task in front of the government is pretty large if you have a long-term view. So basically the main goal of independent fiscal institutions is to introduce the long-term view. And this long-term view then gives us space in short term. That's maybe all I wanted to say. Thanks for your attention.
May I use a little bit of your time, just 1 minute, making 3 points, and then we are ready for the first point is that Martin, stay here for the so there is of course no free lunch, but there is free dinner today. Yeah. The second point is that on monetary and fiscal coordination, we worked a lot together with Professor Banerjee, and he organized even a very nice conference on this topic. And not, today, not 2 years ago. So we recognized very early that this is an important point. And the third point is a shameless self-promo. And this is a thing that, Martin mentioned that we had 2011 a constitutional law on fiscal sustainability. So my co-author and me wrote a paper in 2009, which became the fiscal responsibility law 2 years later. So that's, but that is not important. The important thing is this one. Look at this. If you would like to have a recommendation on questions of art, don't ask me. I'm the last person, in terms of aesthetical feelings and so on. But look at this logo of the Council for Budget Responsibility. It was designed by me. So, the fiscal, forget the fiscal. Look at this logo. I tell you the story. This is the debt level. Look at the debt level is increasing. And here you have the fiscal rules and the council capping that debt level, not allowing the debt level to increase. Okay, so that's it.
Ludo, since you mentioned the book on fiscal monetary policy coordination, the book is in the Ashoka Library. And in one of the panels, Ludo was the keynote speaker.
Okay, so now we are ready for questions, but I mentioned the dinner also because we will be there. So if you have questions you are afraid to ask in public and you would like to ask it privately during the dinner, we will be going around and answering questions if you have more. But there is still space now.
Yeah, can I go ahead? I think I have another simplistic question. The doctor spoke about it in the second part of the talk with regard to European Union commitments. So I'm curious to understand what are some of the responsibilities that you have to keep in mind when there is heterogeneity across the European Union, both with regard to fiscal and monetary policy. And so is there certain restrictions that you have when making these policies as well, given your larger commitment to the European Union? So I just want to know how do you have to weigh that in, given the fact that you're part of the European Union?
Should I start? Okay, so the basic thing is that it was a kind of an entry requirement for entering the euro area. So these are the so-called Maastricht criteria. So member states were supposed to fulfill all those criteria, but then many states had a much higher debt level than the required 60%. So somebody said, okay, so maybe 60 is not so strict. So it is enough, it is decreasing. So that was the first unfortunate step, that actually a lot of countries entered with a not very fit fiscal position into the euro. Once you are inside, there is this stability and growth, like Martin mentioned, but actually nobody was sanctioned. Nobody was sanctioned. And if you look at the chart where you can see the green periods where the country is fulfilling all those requirements from the stability growth plan, and the red is when not, you see a lot of red on the picture. And nobody was sanctioned because first France and Germany broke the rules. And how can you sanction France and Germany? It's easy to sanction Slovakia. Sanction Germany, that's much harder. So there is actually no effective way how to make the countries more responsible. And that is very dangerous. Why is dangerous? Because then the monetary policy is forced to solve the problem, meaning buying the government bonds of all those unresponsible governments and making the euro stable. And that is not sustainable for a very long term. So what we need is clearly a new framework for fiscal responsibility inside the euro area, and you can find it in that book, my ideas at least about these questions.
Maybe a different take on this. I had a slide which I thought that I will not bother you with, but here it is. Basically, the main objective of the European rules is to fight externalities. Okay, we have common monetary policy. We have fiscal policies which create negative externalities for other members in the union. So the objective of the rules is to kind of minimize the externalities. And as economists, we love externalities because that makes economics more interesting and that gives space to a lot of the policies that we like to study. But on the other hand, the lawyers who wrote the EU treaty, they hate externalities because it makes the law complicated. And the lawyers ended up making the EU treaty so complicated and so vague that we didn't achieve the objective in the end because we didn't have the proper tools. On the national front, fiscal rules have completely different objective, and the objective is long-term sustainability. So the rules might seem similar, and in a way they are similar because they try to influence the same policy, but the objective is completely different. And we kind of hope that the national rules will work better, but we yet have to see because as I have shown you, the national rules are very, very young in most countries. There are some exceptions. For example, Netherlands had fiscal rules since, I think, 1960s, and they seem to work well in Netherlands. But let's not get too much hope from that because a lot of other things work well in Netherlands and they don't work so well in terms of policy making and stability in other countries.
Maybe what we can do is just sort of, because of short of time, we can sort of, everybody who has a question, just raise your hand. We'll be able to answer maybe 2-3 questions.
Let's take more and then we can answer.
I would also suggest if the first person who asks the question, if there are any other questions which are in the same theme, that person can ask them questions now, so that you can respond commonly on the.
Yeah. Everyone, so you can ask your question. And
this is my question. This is an national rate of interest. Right? What I didn't understand was that how can we possibly on 0%? Right? Because there must be a trend which would have been followed, right? So that there must be people who would have speculated that there will be a time where the national rate of interest will touch 0, and we will be facing these problems, like to stimulate economic growth. That is. So why has this problem just risen up right now? And even if we were able to predict it in the past, and if we were able to predict it in the past, why didn't we take any action then? And why are we in this position right now? Like,
anybody has a connected question? No?
Okay. I was showing the short-term natural rate, and basically you are asking that how can go that all the way down to 0 if there can be, speculators who can utilize on this. That is the question.
so just it's associated with that. But the only thing is that I thought that there must be a trend which would have been formulated in the past. Yeah, there will be a time which will where the
maybe I try to explain this differently. Okay? Natural rate of interest is in a way the price of future consumption relative to consumption today. But then we subtract 1 from the ratio. Okay, so it can be less than 0, because if your consumption tomorrow or in 1 year is just 90% as valuable as consumption today, okay, if you today are willing to give up 100 bags of rice to get just 90 bags of rice in 1 year, that means that the natural rate of interest is negative 10%. Okay, but the relative price is 90 to 100. So it can easily be negative, because it comes from relative prices of consumption in time, which can go both ways. Okay. And the reason why we were never worried about the prices in the future being kind of lower than prices today is because for the whole history of mankind, population was just growing. So we have always seen for the whole history that there were more and more people, okay, with some wars, famines, or epidemics changing the trend. But besides this one-off shocks, the population was always growing. And it's only starting to happening now that populations in rich countries are already declining, and global population will probably start declining in around 2040. And this has never happened in the history of mankind, that you have a trend of declining population.
I just add the 2 small things. The first thing is that actually it was relatively well understood what are the driving forces of that. One was the famous savings glut, that we globalized the economy, attaching the savings in Asia to that, either voluntary or the government savings in order to keep the exchange rate as low as it is. And also there was a technological change where the nature of investments are changing actually. That before you had to spend a lot of money building a factory. Now if you have an idea, then you can have a company which is valued as much as, I don't know, a big manufacturer. So the relative price of the capital was also changing. But the more down-to-earth explanation is that actually most of our models, the probability of hitting the 0 lower bound was at maximum 2%. So in all our models, we grossly underestimated the likelihood that we will hit the 0 lower bound. So that was. So there were discussions about 0 lower bound. It's a Japanese problem. It's not our problem. It cannot happen in the, and that was a huge mistake.
let's collect 3 questions and then we close the round.
Yeah.
How does the negative rates of interest work? I assume that there would is there, for example, a shock in the economy when everyone tries to take their money out of the bank? I mean, if that were the case, it wouldn't work, but it's clearly working. And how is it? It's only possible in the short run. So how is it that it works?
Any other questions? I feel like this probably even falls in the previous bucket, but any other questions on those lines?
No, you can different things. We will collect 3.
Oh, yeah, maybe in the interest of time, go ahead.
So my question is more around asking like what considerations you make while entering the euro back, because like from what I can say, it's a clear trade-off. Because once you enter the eurozone, you can't like control your monetary policy. It's like you have to follow what's happening in the dollar, and like the only way you can control like the economy would be through fiscal measures there, and that takes longer, and also you can increase expenditure, which will lead to increase debt. So what are some of the considerations you made, and like what do you think about like Greece in general, because like they've seen their economy so much. So they have massive levels of debt, and they can't even change their interest rate.
Well, just maybe I think we only have time for 2 questions. So
maybe I take on your last question in a very simple way. This city or the greater Delhi is about 20 million people. Would you argue that this area needs its own monetary policy independent from the rest of India? Slovakia is 5 million people. Okay, so it's less than this city. And our economy is relatively well integrated within the euro area. So if you are not willing to argue very strongly that this city needs its own currency independent from Mumbai or Kolkata currency, then maybe we don't need our own currency, because the shocks that hit the European markets are almost the same as the shocks that hit the Slovak markets. And therefore, in most cases, the European monetary policy will be appropriate for us. And it happens relatively seldom that we would need a different monetary policy than the rest of Europe. And that was exactly the case of Greece, that in fact the Greek economy was very different from the rest of Europe. And they needed different policy. And the second problem was that in fact their fiscal policy was not sustainable. So if they had some of the rules I was arguing for before, and if they had more fiscal space, they wouldn't have problem with monetary policy either. But a large monetary union like Europe, which is economically large, then it makes a lot of sense to have independent monetary policy. For small countries, it makes progressively less and less sense. And maybe you draw the line somewhere around, I don't know, 50, maybe 100 million people, or the size of the economy. It also depends on the nature of the economy. If it's very different from the rest of the monetary union, then obviously you might need your own monetary policy more.
I used to say, actually, I worked in the bank when we worked out the strategy for euro adoption, and we were setting interest rates. So I always told that we are working hard to lose our jobs, because that in Frankfurt the interest rates, I think, will be impacted. But we managed that also with the help of Professor Banerjee. He played a quite interesting role in that process. He can tell you during the dinner, which is a nice story. On the negative interest rate side, maybe I do not want to go into too many details, but just to illustrate the 2 thresholds. The one threshold is, as I mentioned, that keeping cash is extremely costly if you keep it in big amounts. So you can go below 0, but not very, very far from 0. So it is estimated that actually maybe -1% is okay, -2% would be too much. So that is one threshold. The other threshold is actually the transmission from the rate of the bank to the retail deposits. Because if the negative interest rate is so big in the negative territory that the banks are translating those rates into negative rates to people, then the whole system will break down. So we cannot go as far as that. So that is why most of the central bank started very slowly. And for the future, just my take on it is that most of the central bank will be hesitant, more hesitant to go into negative territory in the future because it had no sizable benefits, while it had a lot of negative side effects. If you have negative interest rates, the bond markets, the pension fund savings, and so on. So maybe they will use more asset purchases and forward guidance and a bit less negative interest rates. But that is just my opinion on that.
So there is another dimension. If you have a current account, which most enterprises have, you get 0 nominal rate, but you have to pay a fee for maintenance of your accounts, which in a way is negative.
It's a negative. Yes.
Maybe I'll try to confuse you a bit more. Okay. The reason why interest rates can be negative, sometimes deeply negative, is because we don't have any good technology for storing consumption. Okay? If you have goods, actual physical goods, or something that you want to consume, it's relatively easy to ship them from one country to another country. Okay? It's very difficult to take the goods and ship them into the future. Okay? Time travel is extremely difficult. We move through time only one way and very slowly. So if you have something you would like to consume in 10 years, actually storing that stuff is costly and risky. So instead, we invented the financial markets, or the mankind has invented the financial markets. And if you want to consume in the future, if you want to save for the future, you don't save actual goods. And services are even harder to save. Okay? You cannot get 5 haircuts now, and then your hair will be cut in 5 years. But we save by lending money to somebody else and then believing that whoever we lent the money to will give us the money back in the future. But that depends very crucially on there being someone who wants to borrow. And if there is nobody to borrow, then our technology for saving, of moving our consumption into the future, becomes very difficult. And that's why when there are more and more old people, or people who are getting older, and all of us want to save, all of us wants to have the stash of gold for our retirement, but it's not actually gold, or it's not the pieces of paper that matter. It's the consumption of actual goods that will matter to us. So we need to find somebody now that wants to take our money and give us the goods as a payment later on. And when there are fewer and fewer young people that want to borrow, it will become much harder for us to get some interest, and the interest might easily be negative.
But for Slovakia as such, we can invest in India. India is still growing and booming, and that can save us.
Thank you for your eloquent answer. And if you have any sort of further questions, as they said, you can always ask them at the dinner. But we're wrapping this event and bringing it to close. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you so much, Dr. Schuster, Mr. Odo, for giving these talks. They were really wonderful. And thank you, Professor Banerjee. Without you, this event wouldn't have happened. Thank you so much. And thank you for showing up. Good night.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Wait, we are not finished. Thanks a lot for everything. Everyone in this room is invited to dinner. Right? That's the first thing. Second, in appreciation of the organizational effort and for making the event happen as seamlessly as it has been done. As Governor Oda and Dr. Schuster would like to show an appreciation of the 5 members of the Economic Society, the office bearers. So here's a token gift for each of them. Kavira he qualifies, right? Yeah, come.
It is a very special €2 coin. Martin was talking about multipliers, so there is a multiplier of 75 for this coin at least, so because it is a special edition.
It's worth more than €2.
Yeah.
And don't touch it with your hands.
Okay. Thank you for all that.
Okay.
It's an art, guys.
He has already got his, and Bilkis. Now one member is absent. She's gone to Pune, Nasik, or so you can give it to you.
Who is the most credible? We need to find the most credible person.
Let's go to six values. Give it to him.
So thank you.
Just one second. The event is not yet over. We have to honor our guests, the speakers. We have acknowledged the feat of the organizers. Now we have to acknowledge the contribution to knowledge which the speakers have done.
Thank you. So time travel is possible because these are 10 years of Ashoka, and that will be, I guess, shortly. We are already in the future.
Yes. Now, they have got their support from the spouses. So their good performance reflects the continued support of the spouses. They have not given them time. So, in appreciation of that, the positive role played in their academic and professional life. Thank you for coming to Ashoka. We are dinner. Thank you very much for being here.
Everyone, please disconnect movements from Sudarshan and please see your dinner and information.
Put it in the back. Okay.